Welcome y'all to the Microsoft 365 Azure group, reborn into the cloud. We've got Paul Schaeflein here with us today from the lovely state of Illinois. Paul's going to be presenting on one of his favorite topics because, according to Paul, Azure Active Directory is really easy, as is authentication.
Auth is easy.
Authentication and authorization is cake. But with that, don't want to drone on too long. Paul, I'll just go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. So I guess we want to confirm we can see a slide. It's got the corporate overlords logo on it, right? Are we good there?
Good for me.
Okay, and so first a little bit about me. As Dan said, my name is Paul Schaeflein. I am the technical architect for Admin 365. That's enough we have to say about the work. So I co-host the Microsoft 365 Developer Podcast with Jeremy Thake. That's in the red square. I'm the guy with less hair. And I've been graciously awarded the MVP award from Microsoft for many, many years now, currently in office development. And you'll see I have my Twitter handle and email address up there. I'm happy to follow up with questions after the fact. If you shoot me an email, just give me some context as to what you're talking about when the question comes in. It'd be great, where you saw the session, whatever. I will try to monitor the chat window. I don't have anything going on. Today's the last, quote, work day until the new year, so I'm happy to stick around and answer questions in the chat as well. So just be patient with that, and I'll try to get to them. So what are we going to talk about? What is Microsoft Graph? What are access tokens? How do I get one? And then Q&A, right? Simple, just three little things. So not too many slides. Demos will go through, and then we'll try to cover any questions you have. I should point out that I've been doing this a long, long time, written SharePoint code, Teams code, Bot Framework, .NET. So if you have questions that are kind of tangential to the topic, I'm happy to field those as well when we get in the Q&A section. So just let me know. So I like to start my presentations with the official marketing blurb from Microsoft, make them happy, and just kind of set the expectations. And so basically, Microsoft Graph is an API that we can use to get all the data out of Microsoft's cloud. We have the fancy graphic here that shows how things are linked together, and graph is the computer term that means a set of related entities. And so if I have a user, I can get a link to that user's messages, and from their messages there might be a meeting request. I can go and see what their meetings are and who are the attendees in the meetings, and so on and so on and so on. So there's plenty of prior art out in the world if you want to learn more about Microsoft Graph, but this is what we're talking about today, is that we are writing code that is going to consume this information, or maybe update information, but we want to interact with the Microsoft Graph API. This slide kind of sums up very well what we're trying to accomplish in what we call the Microsoft, and let me mute my phone, the Microsoft 365 platform. And so we'll step through this a little bit. At the very bottom, everything is built upon the Microsoft Identity platform, and we're going to talk more about that now. I know that you had Christos Matkis do a presentation on the Identity platform a couple of months back, and so if you haven't seen that, I highly recommend that. Christos was on our podcast as well. He's got great information. I'm going to use some of that code that he demonstrated and wrote as part of what I'm doing as well. So everything is built on top of the Microsoft Identity platform. That's kind of a generic term for Azure Active Directory. And so most people who are consuming the graph are using that in the context of a Microsoft 365 tenant with their company, or with the company, the tenant of their customers. There are some pieces of the Microsoft Graph that can work for consumer accounts, what are called Microsoft accounts, Hotmail, Outlook.com, Live.com, etc. I'm not going to go too much into detail on that, but that is kind of supported by the Microsoft Identity platform as well as Microsoft Graph. And now we're moving a step up for Microsoft Identity. You'll see they show we have our data coming in through connectors, and we can export our data using the Graph Data Connect, and everything in the middle is the stuff that we called into Microsoft using what they call the REST APIs. REST APIs is a geeky term, which basically means I can make an HTTP request, or I can make a request just like the browser does. If I craft it correctly and I provide the right information, it'll come back and give me data. And what data am I getting? Well, that's the previous slide with all the fancy lines. But at the very top of this, or the next level up, is talking about Microsoft 365 experiences and your own experiences. And I want to dive into that a little bit. When they say extending Microsoft 365 experiences, that means you are putting some custom code in a application written by Microsoft. For example, SharePoint web part, or in the Office or the client applications, you can do the task pane on the right-hand side, or you have a bot that's interacting with the Microsoft Teams channel through the bot framework. So the primary experience is provided by Microsoft, and you are augmenting that or enhancing that by extending it with your code. On the right-hand side there, it says building your own experiences, and this is where they say it's actually the bot or agent, but it's also a web app, or it's a daemon app, which could be like Azure Functions or whatever the case may be. So regardless of what you're trying to accomplish, you can interact with Microsoft Graph and the consume the data, update data as necessary. So this is our overview of the graph. Right. So what are access tokens? And this is the slide that Dan knows is coming ahead of time. Authentication is the process of verifying a principal's identity. So as the song says, who are you? When I want to log in, I am authenticating to a system. And so in the most common example in this case would be I go to SharePoint.com and I get a login screen and I have to type in a username and password and optionally do multi-factor authentication with my phone or whatever the case may be. I am verifying who I am. And when we write our code to interact with the Microsoft Graph, we do not do authentication. We are letting the Microsoft Identity Platform handle that for us. This is a very good thing because they're probably much better at verifying information and securely saving information than I am. I know they're better than me. I assume they're better than most folks. So this is authentication is letting someone else verify who that person is who's coming in. And authorization will then determine which resource this principal can access. And this is where we get into our code. And so if we have a group of users who are administrators to our application versus a group of people who are read and write versus a group of people who are read only, those are different roles, and I authorize a user to do different things in my application based on knowing who they are. Well, this is the same concept we get in Microsoft Graph. We have the concept of delegated permissions and app-only permissions, and I can read messages, or I can read all those dots we saw in the first slide can be individually permissioned and say, are we going to allow folks to do that? Is Paul allowed to read Dan's email address? No, right? Now Dan can grant access, but this is kind of the concept of this authorization of understanding who is there, and then what are they allowed to do? Right? And an access token and also an identity token kind of fit in there. And so if we think about the different types of security tokens that we need, we have an identity token or an ID token. When a user authenticates and verifies who they are, we have an ID token that represents who that user is. We acquire that token using the OpenID Connect protocol. And if I look at that token, I will see different claims about who the user is. Typically, I get their login ID, their surname, their given name, and maybe some other information. But it's really minimal stuff. That's all it is. This is what we know about this person. When I want to connect to Microsoft Graph, I don't need an ID token. I need an access token. And the access token is going to say, this is what Microsoft is going to use the access token for that authorization check that we talked about, right? And so now an access token, it's given to us by Microsoft's identity platform or Azure AD, and then we give it back to Microsoft Graph. Microsoft Graph turns around and talks to Azure AD and says, I've got this token. What does it mean, right? And so what gets confusing is typically inside the access token, there will be a claim that represents who the user is. But the access token doesn't necessarily mean that that person has logged in. And this is because there's this other concept called the refresh token, which I can grant access to an application to say, once I log in, I'm going to let you log in for me offline. Let's say, for example, you want to have a user schedule a job that runs overnight. So you will prompt them a screen with, they log into your application, and then you get all the information about what they're going to run and when, and then they click save, and you schedule it in the background. Well, in the background, you need to log in as that user or use that user's permissions to do something. How do you do that? They're this middle of the night. They're not logged on. This refresh token would let me get an access token on behalf of that user. And so that kind of breaks the distinction. Even though access token kind of blurs the line between who it is and what they're allowed to do, that's just because they're giving us this capability to say, well, I want to connect later or offline access, right? Now, the other option, or the other thing, sometimes these tokens can be acquired using what we call app only or as a security principle. The idea, of course, is that maybe there is no user. Maybe I set up this application to do things all by itself without a user's context. Now, doing that requires much more due diligence, if you will, on behalf of your IT staff, right? They should be reviewing what this code is before they do that. And there's a whole process of consenting an application to do that. So I may bounce through the consent screen. I don't think so, because as I was testing my code yesterday, I kind of did all that, but I wasn't really focusing so much on the consent process in this talk. There's plenty of prior art, as we say, about there that you can go and find that out. And so those are what we're talking about here. I want to get an access token, and I'm going to there's multiple ways to do that. And when I use that, then I can call the Microsoft Graph. Okay, so I'm going to check the chat window here while we grab a drink. All right.
Oh, you're in the clear, man.
All righty.
Tracking and following and loving the fact that you're going to go into demo land and awe us all.
Yes. Well, yeah. Thanks for managing expectations, buddy. So how do I get an access token? I'm a former consultant. It depends. How is it you're getting what is it you're trying to accomplish using these different things? So my goal is to go through all of these, although I don't think the function app bit, we're going to have time for that. And so, but at least we'll go through them. So now I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio Code. And now I don't know how well this will present because of my monitor size. So let me just choose screen one. And if someone could let me know, is this too big? Do I want to just do a share of maybe just one screen or zoom in?
If you could zoom it in just a little bit.
Sure, I don't know how to do that in this stupid toy that we have here.
I think it should just be like Command Shift plus or
zoom in is Control equals.
Control equal, yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, beautiful.
I'll do one more. So what I have here is a SharePoint framework web part. I went to the tutorial from the documentation to get that. And actually, before I go further, I have this. I'm going to put this link in the chat window, and this link is my blog post that I created just for this that I can go through and list all my resources here. So I'll put that in there. And on this page, consume the Microsoft Graph in the SharePoint framework. And this is the example that I did, and then I tweaked it a little bit. So I started here just to show how to get Microsoft Graph-y things. So I went through the whole process of doing Yo SharePoint, installing and downloading half of the internet with node modules, and then I popped this open. So a couple things I want to talk about here. First of all, what's the code doing? They have this method here that says search with graph, and the idea here is that I'm going to make a call to get users. I'm using the V1 endpoint, and then I want to select the display name, the mail, and user principal name of anybody who starts with a value that I type in. And so this concept here, this is me building up the query in the Microsoft SharePoint's Graph Client Factory. So that's the next thing we'll talk about. So when you're in SharePoint, I log into SharePoint in the browser. It is a Microsoft service. It's backed by the Microsoft Identity Platform. And so the developers of the SPF of SharePoint framework have created this API called the MS Graph Client Factory. And the MS Graph Client Factory behind the scenes does all the magic that has to happen to let me get a token for the current user. So when I run my code on a SharePoint page, it can be an extension or it can be a web part, but either way, the user's already logged in. I'm already getting a bunch of stuff from my SharePoint already from Microsoft on the page. And so why do I want to do something different? And that's the idea around this Microsoft Graph, MS Graph Client Factory. So I get, using this client factory, I say, get a client. And when I get that client, then I can just run the API method here to build out my query, right? And so that's as simple as I need to do in my code. What the rest of this example will do is it will then do this call. When it comes back, it's going to just put them into a table. So you can see here, if I look at the output, it's just outputting a details list, which renders as a table. So nothing fancy there. However, I can't just deploy my code to SharePoint and have it work. Remember, we talked before about how users have to get a token. This MS Graph Client Factory is going to get a token on behalf of the current user, and there's the whole consent process. So inside the SharePoint framework, I have to update this package solution file. And specifically, I need to go in here and add this entry into the package solution.json file, which then in turn gets bundled into my web part manifest. And what I'm saying here is that I want to access the resource called Microsoft Graph, and I need a scope called user.readbasic.all. This will then allow me to read basic information about users. So how do I know what scope I need there? So let's take a little detour and we'll go into graph.microsoft.com. And graph.microsoft.com, when I go into the API reference, and if I want to read information about the user, when I say get a user, on this page, it tells me these are the permissions that are required for me to make a call to get user information. All SPFX requests are delegated. And so I need any one of these will let me access user information. Now, if you'll notice, there is user.read and there is user.readbasic.all. So if something just says .read, or if it's missing the .all, then what that means is the current user. So user.read permission will let my application read information about the current user. User.readbasic.all will let my application read basic information about all users in the tenant. And our sample is going to be searching for users, so of course I want to search them all, right? That's most likely what I want. And even though that sounds scary, users can open their email client and search the gal and find every user anyway, so it's not like we're giving away the secret here, right? So this is what we can see here. This is letting me read all information. Now, obviously, there's more. I could say read all, which gives me more information than just basic, and then there's user read write, and so on and so forth. So this is what we're doing here, and that's why in my permission request, I'm saying I need user.readbasic.all. Okay. Now, I will switch over to SharePoint, which I've already logged in here. This is this application, and if things are working today, I can do a search and processing, and boom, there we go. So my tenant has two users that start with Alex and Avocado. So we're good to go there, right? That's the idea here. Really pretty simple. I write my code, I fill out this permission request. But there's things that have to happen when this is deployed behind the scenes. And again, now, so I will show you the screens in SharePoint, and then we'll go to the slides because I've done some of the setup already, and then I can show you what the screens look like before I permissioned it. So in SharePoint, a couple things that I had to do. First of all, I went into the app catalog, and in the app catalog for this tenant, I actually uploaded my SPFX project, right? So there's plenty of ways to learn about how to create an SPFX solution, but in my apps for SharePoint, you will then see I have the SPFX API scopes tutorial client-side solution. There we go. And it's been uploaded and deployed, and life is good. Now, because this manifest has the web API permissions, that means that users had to, the administrators had to consent on this. And the way that is done is in the SharePoint administration page, there's a section called API access. And with this API access, once it catches up here, we'll see that there are two different requests that have already been approved. And here is the one, Microsoft Graph user.readbasic.all. That matches my entry here. Now, when I first deployed this, this was in pending, and I had to choose it and click the approve button. since it's approved, I have the remove access button. And if I go back to the slides, I should be able to show that to you, right? So, I'm sorry, I missed a step. When I first deployed it, it told me, hey, go to the API management page to approve pending permissions. So when the user added the web part to the site, or the site owner adds it to the site, they're told there are permissions that need to be reviewed. And then in the administration page, here it was saying it's pending. And so I can then choose it, and you can see here it lists the package was being done and when it was requested and so on. So Microsoft Graph user.readbasic.all, and we're all set. As you can see, we're able to run that page. So now it seems to have gone away. I love how it goes away without me wanting it to. If I go back to my Nova site, and I hope you saw it before because it seems to have vanished. I love SharePoint. I keep telling myself that one day I'll believe it. Here we go. So I have and of course this should work. I also have Adele. She should be in here. Yeah, and there's Adele. Okay, so that's the SharePoint framework stuff. And switch over. I don't see anything in the chat. Looks good. Awesome. So now let's talk about a console application. I've been doing this for a long time, so for me that means .NET. So I'm going to open up, I have this here. I'm going to have to zoom this one up, and I don't need Dan's help on that one. I know how to do that here. So this is a console application. This is .NET Core 3.1. Yes, I know .NET Core 5 is out, but I haven't gotten there yet. And so this is a sample. Now this sample is part of what we call the Graph Community Library. And I don't know, I put that in my resources, so I will show that here. So it's GitHub, Microsoft Graph. I will make sure that my resources page has this link on it when we're done here. But this is the Graph Community Library. Now this started out with me writing some code that would call SharePoint from this, but it's been extended since then. So I'm going to show this to you here just because I'm using it. But what does this code do? Right. So at the end of the day, I'm doing this call here, and I want to make a call. And I've set it up to do 2 different calls. The first one is I'm going to search for Al, and I do this filter string. And now if you look, this is very similar to the code that we had in our SharePoint framework web part. If I look back here, where I'm doing starts with, right? So the given name and the surname, both, or the display name, and you start with a value. And if I go back to here, it's the same code. Now it's formatted a little different here. I don't have to get, I have a graph service client, so I will talk about how to get that. But that's the idea. So I did one call here that says get all the users, and then given a certain user, I want to add that user to a group. Now this might already exist, so we'll just change the name there so that it creates a new one. And so how does this work? A couple things I want to walk through here. So I'm going to scroll back up to the top of this application, and we'll go through what it's doing here. So a couple things that need to be configured. When I'm using I'm not in SharePoint anymore, so I have to do all the setup work myself. And so I need to register an application with my Azure Active Directory. And so if I switch back over to that tenant, and we'll go over to the Azure AD portal, even if you don't have a Azure subscription, you can get to this page. It's aad.portal.azure.com, and I can log in here, and there's no subscription listed. It just lists the directory. And in the directory, I can go to app registrations, and this one that we're looking at right now is the community sample-public client, and this is my application that I'm using. Here's the overview with some magic numbers here. Well, first thing I want to show you is I configured this to say API. I want this application to be able to read 2 different permission scopes from Microsoft Graph. Under the add permission, I choose Graph. I can use delegated or application. When I do that, boom, I get a whole long list of all the fun things that I can do. So I previously went in here and I said, I want user.read and user.readbasic.all. All right. Now I have this application and it has an ID and it belongs in a specific tenant. So those 2 values I needed to put into my application. So I open up the app settings file, there's that information. I have a tenant and a client ID. And just to make sure I'm looking at the right one, oops, I'm not looking at the right one. Interesting. 8F8, Well, that's interesting. Why is it not there? Let's change that so it works. I copy that, put that in here. Right, now it's the right one. So this code, we'll go through, and it does some basic information here. This is just .NET code, .NET Core code to read the configuration file and set an object that has those options. And then I'm going to do some other setup work here. I want to show the log, what's happening, so I can show you what's happening here. But here's the key thing about getting the access token. I can use the system browser. How that works is I'm saying I'm creating what's called a public client, and I'm saying this is a single tenant application using the public cloud. There's different values here for government or sovereign clouds. Here's my information, and the redirect URI is my local host. And when I create this public client application, combined with the interactive authentication provider provided by Microsoft Graph, it will then prompt the user to get the information, right? Now, I'm going to change this, the user.readbasic.all, because when I make the request for the scopes, I want it to use the same one that's been consented. So that's my setup. This is all I need to do, right? Is I configure my public client, again, using the libraries provided by Microsoft for the MSAL library, and then the Microsoft Graph SDK. So I create a public client application. You tell it I want to use the interactive authentication provider, and then I'm going to create my graph service client. And when I have my graph service client, I then get IntelliSense that will tell me all the different things that I can query. Users, I want to filter and get this. And you can see I'm using my typical constructs for asynchronous code. So let's give it a shot. What's the worst thing that could happen, right?
Stay Puft Marshmallow Man?
Yeah, there you go. Okay, so notice nothing's really happened yet. I hit my breakpoint. Even though I've set up this authentication, really I haven't tried to access Microsoft Graph yet, so it hasn't prompted me to authenticate. So I'm going to continue on, press F5 here, and now you'll notice it opened up a new window. This is my console application on the left. On the right, it popped open the default browser. And now I can now log in, and I'm going to use my account that we are using here. If I pick this account, because in this browser session I already logged in, you know what? It's probably the right number to begin with. It didn't work. So, okay, what's the worst that could happen is I can't log in. So let me go back to here. It's interesting that I made it work on the wrong one, but we'll try it again. But my point is, remember I talked before about the Microsoft Identity Platform and letting someone else handle the login for me? In this browser session, I'm already logged into SharePoint. I'm already logged into Azure. I'm using the Microsoft Identity Platform already. So it didn't prompt me for a password because it has that session. And that's one of the benefits that we can do if we write in code. We say, hey, just go ahead and use what's already in use by the user. So again, who am I doing? I'm choosing my dev account. And now it's saying, okay, you're asking for permission, right? If you remember, that application said user.read and readbasic.all. So it wants to user.read is this basic profile. Read all users basic profile is readbasic.all, right? And then this maintain access is because in the consent I can show it to you, but the offline access was ticked or selected, and that refresh token we talked about, that is maintain data that you have access to it. Now, because I'm logged in as an administrator, I get this box here. I'm not going to do that. It's going to say accept. And then done. And now if I go back to my application, right, it says group. And now, boom, it's because I didn't log much in here and I forgot to show information. But let me go back to my code here. It's actually waiting right here at this press enter bit. So I'm going to put a breakpoint here. If I press enter, it breaks. A couple things I want to show you. If I go to my users object, come on. And it should pop up with my, oh, I'm out of scope already. Doggone it. All right, that's okay. We'll run it again. Let me just go through and show the log. Let's continue. What the application has done is it has done this log. So let me copy this and we'll put it into a slightly better for reading information. And go back to code and do a new page and paste this in. And go to the top. So the first thing that happened was it did a call to /v1/users, and notice it's the filter, right? This string here is from my code that I put in here, right? So this graph service client.users with the filter string gets translated to this endpoint. It made a call, and the response is this bit right here. So let me copy that, and I'll put that here, and I'll say that this is a JSON file and format it so you can see it a little bit better. And on the response then comes back with an JSON array, and here's the first one, that is Al, and the second one is Alex, right? And so because everything happened, now I'm not showing you in my log the access token, but that's the idea. That was the first call that made. The next part of the code would run through. After that, it would get the Al account, just as one user. Notice that I'm indexing the user array. So now if I look on this one, what I'm getting is user Al. I get one particular user. And then further down, you'll see I create a group, and I'm creating a groups. Notice here it says on this group, I want you to add a group named Nova365UG, and I put Al into that group membership. And so now this third request is a post to the groups endpoint. And if we look here at the data that gets sent, and then there's the name, and all the information that was in my code, you'll see is here. Oops, let me fix that. And then here is this member, right? So here's the list of members. And if I look here, and there's the, notice now that it has Al. It doesn't say Al at scdev. It uses the GUID that represents Al. And I can see that was the response. If I look here in this line 43, we'll go over to the right, all the way to the right. Oops. And there is Al's ID. And so my code was able to query, get the ID, and then use that in this post request to create the group. And the response is that it was created for me, right? Stuff I'd expect to see. Now, again, this all happens because in my code, I set up my public client application that I needed to from Microsoft MSAL. And then I use the Authentication Provider from Microsoft Graph. All right, so I'm going to press enter here. Now, the other one I can run for you is I'm going to do a different one here with my Diagnostic Logging. So let me go back here and run this one. And if I go into my diagnostics, you're going to see something very similar here, but this does a little bit more advanced in the logging. So again, I'm doing the same configuration setup here to get the Azure Active Directory settings. I also do my string builder for the log, and then I'm going to go into here and so the MSAL provides logging. And so by creating this delegate, I can then write the information that the MSAL library is reporting. And so that's the first part of MSAL logging. And then when I create the client down here, I've added this line that says with logging. So choosing verbose. And so when the Microsoft Authentication Library, the MSAL library, tries to connect, remember it's going to open up the current browser and do all that work for me. Any messages that it does will be logged to that delegate. And what my delegate is doing is just putting it into this logger, which happens to be a string builder, which is that thing I dump out at the end. So we'll see that when we're done here. Right. And then there's some other logging that's part of the community library that we'll go through and get information. And this is primarily if you're doing SharePointy things, so I'm not going to worry about that too much. But the idea, of course, here is it's an event listener, and it's going to do the same thing at the end of the day. It's putting the same information in the logger. And so this particular one, I'm using a public client application. And now here's another thing that what it is doing is it's using a token cache. So this particular example is using a token cache. And if I go into that token cache helper, you'll see all it's doing is it's using a file called msalcache.bin in the current location of the file. So it's writing a cache of the tokens that I get from Azure Active Directory locally. And if I run the application more than one time, it should use that, right? That's the idea around using the token cache. So if I go back to my diagnostic, so that's what we're doing here. Now this particular one, we don't want to use that scope. So let me change this again. We'll copy that and we'll put that one here because that's the scope that we really want to do. And you'll notice here again using the interactive authentication provider. And then this particular example is just making a call out to something, but we're going to want to change that. So this one's getting app tiles from SharePoint, and I don't want to do that. So what we're going to do instead is go back to our user. We're just going to get Al. So let me come down here, and the bit that does the get Al, copy that, and we're going to put that here. Oh, even better. We'll just use this one that says get me, and it writes the name. All right, so hopefully I haven't screwed it up too much. We'll try it again. That's my previous authentication. I'm going to close that one. We're going to close that failed one, and I close that. Hey, it ran, and it showed Paul Schaeflein, but it didn't prompt me to log in. Again, the token cache is working. If I press enter to see the log here, lots of stuff happening here. You'll see here, it's going through. Here is the MCell library. So I should probably copy these for you. So let me select all this. And I'll go back to my note. I don't need that one. I don't need that one. And if we look in here, here is the MCell logging that's happening here. And if I scroll over to the right, you can see the details of what's happening here. Hey, it found one RT and one account in my MCell cache. RT is refresh tokens. So it found the refresh token in there. And so it's going to try to use it. Okay, and it worked, and it didn't. It tried to use the network cache, didn't work. And then it says, do I know who the metadata is? What we're happening here is it says, oh, I have a token, but I need to know what tenant that token is for. So I'm using the metadata to do that. It found all that. Life is good. It found one cache account, so it's using that at one account. And then it says, okay, now that I have the cached account here, I'm going to acquire my token silently. The idea here is that it will do it silently, and if it works, I'm done. If it doesn't work, then I'll prompt the user that they have to log in. And so it tries the silent login. It came in and said, oh, well, it's Paul. Yep, and that's who your account you're logging in with, and it's that ID, and everything matches. So therefore, force refresh is false, which means the token that I have is good. There's nothing else needs to happen here. And then further down, you can see the actual request was made to the Microsoft endpoint for me automatically. It came through. This is the information that it sent. It's trying to read the current user, which needs user.read permissions. And then there's a whole bunch more logging that happens here. But of course, the idea, of course, that it just worked. And then down here, this is my logging. It says get the me, and here's the response that has my information. So of course, that's all great. But look, how does it really? Does it work like we expect? What I'm going to do real quick here is I go back to this one. Oh, I need to press enter to end. And if I go to this application, open the folder, and in my bin folder, I realize this might be really small and you can't see, but I have mcelcache.bin file. This file right here is that token cache. I'm going to delete it. And now if I run again, I'm expecting it to prompt me to log in because it can't find the cache. And there it is. It's prompting for the login, and this is going to look just like we did the first time. I picked because I'm already logged in. It's running now as me, and authentication is complete. And it pops over, hey, we got Paul. Oh, the last thing I wanted to show you is if I go back to my directory, we created a group. Go into my group. I have a Nova 365 user group. There we go. It was created today. It has a user. I'm expecting that user to be Al. And there it is. So that's the code that's working here. So that's the idea around this. Now, a couple things to point out. I know I'm racing through here. I'm sorry. I'm going to make sure my timing's good. I got no messages good. In the currently, if I want to use this authentication provider, you'll see here I'm using this. Let me stop this. I'm using the interactive authentication provider, and that is provided to me by the Microsoft Graph SDK. So that is going to be in GitHub. Let me go to this browser window because it's got all my favorites in here. This one. This is the library, the Microsoft MS Graph SDK.NET Auth that goes through and provides this authentication library. And you'll notice here it has a confidential client application. I'm sorry, that's MCell. Here we go. So these are the ones that we care about here. We have a device code provider, which would say, go to a certain URL and type in this 8-digit code. And when you do that 8-digit code and log in, then behind the scenes, my code can continue on. So that's the device code providers provided. The integrated Windows authentication provider, right? If my local PC, Windows 10, is domain joined to my Azure Active Directory tenant, it will automatically log in based on the current user, right? The interactive authentication provider is the one that we did. They have the one that you should never ever use, the username password provider. Okay, and so these are things that are provided as part of this separate library. Now, a word of caution, this library is in preview, and Microsoft has said it will not go GA because they are working with the Azure team and leveraging the, they're working together with the Azure team. The Azure has a concept of managed credentials or a shared credentials. It's called a token credential and a chain token credential that will automatically log into Azure services using various reasons. And the Microsoft Graph team has said, we will work with the Azure team to make that a common scenario, which makes sense because typically, if you're saving data, you're going to store it in the cloud somewhere. And so what I'm showing you is preview code, but I've had no issues with it. The source code is available if you need to have it. Just to show you here, my NuGet packages, you'll see I have a link to Microsoft Graph off, and that's where I get that. So that's my console application, right? Now, next I want to go to a web application. And again, I'll just check real quick. I'm not seeing any messages. Okay, excellent. And so let me go to my other application and open the web app. Now, this particular one is based on the sample that Microsoft provided, but not quite. And so like I said, I put this in GitHub and you can read it as well. But if you think back or go back and look at Christos's presentation, he talked about the Microsoft.identity.web library that helps us do this. And why do we care? When I run my console app, I'm logging in with a user, right? I'm prompting who is the user. And my console application, I can have as many instances of it as I want, and each instance is going to make each individual user log in. When I run in a web application, in theory, I could have multiple users with different accounts, different permissions, using different sessions in my web application. And so if I do that code that I had done before, where I say I want to prompt the user to log in, number one, I need to make sure I'm doing that separate for each user. And number two, that's not how logins work necessarily in web applications. And so the Microsoft Identity Web helps us extend the startup of a .NET web app. In .NET web apps, either Blazor or MVC or anything like that, we have this option called Add Authentication. And you can see here it does OpenID Connect defaults, and it does this. So this Add Authentication sets up the middleware that's part of ASP.NET, which will then go through. And the idea, of course, here is that a request comes into a controller or a page. And if I go into that page and show you my index page, the index page, the code behind, oops, I lost my authorization tag. If I further down, I've said that I want to use authentication. So in my application, I've said, don't show any pages unless the user is authenticated. And then I add the authentication middleware. And what ends up happening is, again, black magic. If a request comes into a page and I don't know who the user is because the browser hasn't logged them in, and again, that could be cookies or tokens or whatever the case may be, however my server is configured, it will then redirect them to the OpenID Connect settings, which is going to be coming in from app settings. And so in this particular example, it's going to say, oh, I want you to log in using that ID. Hey, there's that ID, right? And so that's the idea here. It uses the OIDC or OpenID Connect sign-in page. And that's all done for me automatically as part of ASP.NET if I do logins there. Well, how do I get a token for Microsoft Graph? Remember, when a user logs in, they're issued an ID token, and an ID token doesn't do me any good in Microsoft Graph. I need to have an access token. And so the Microsoft.identity.web gives us this shortcut method that will then go through and say, okay, I want you to also, as part of that black magic that happens in the middleware that says get an ID token, I want you to also get a token for a downstream API, right? And so that downstream API is going to be Microsoft Graph. And I want you to cache those tokens in memory. And there's plenty of other options. And again, look at Christos's presentation or a lot of the information the identity team has put out. I can do it. But the idea, of course, here is that I'm configuring my web application with additional middleware written by Microsoft that will then intercept that call, or when, first of all, it intercepts the call and says, if you're anonymous, go log in. And after the login happens, it says, okay, I know who you are. I'm going to also go get a token for Microsoft Graph and put it in a memory cache so that the next time you browse the page, I can do the same concept. If it's in the cache, I'll use it. If it's not, I can redirect you. And this is where part of the middleware helps, is because what if the first time I'm making this request, I need to provide consent? How do I do that? The middleware that this Microsoft Identity .web will do that middleware for me, right? And this is the section here where I say add the identity UI. This identity UI will handle the, oh, you need to provide consent, and handle the response to that consent and update the token cache as well. So this is information, the code that the library that Microsoft provides that we want to do. If I look at my packages, you'll see I've installed Microsoft.identity.web and Microsoft.identity.web UI. And then because I'm doing this option here that says add Microsoft Graph, I add this Microsoft.identity.web.Microsoft Graph. So at the end of the day, I've configured, I want Microsoft Identity.web to get involved to help me out. I want it to get a token for a downstream app. I want to do all that work. What it will also do is it'll update my dependency injection container with that Graph Services client. And so in my account, my profile page, in the profile page, oh, by the way, there's my authorize, right? And so my profile page, I'm using dependency injection, and where's my constructor? Here it is here. In this dependency injection, I'm saying I want you to inject a Graph Service Client object for me. That this call in startup, add Microsoft Graph, did all that work similar to what I did in my setup here, where I created a client application and I set up the Authentication Provider. All that work was done for me. I should bump this up, my apologies. This method does similar work for me in the web space. So all I can say is give me a Graph Service Client as part of the dependency injection. And then I can do the same information here. And you can see here it's saying, hey, I want whatever the search string is, I'm going to search for those users. And if it's empty, I'm going to choose user identity.name. And this is kind of gets us into the ID token versus access token bit. This code right here, this user account, is a system.security.claims principal object provided by ASP.NET. This user object is not from Microsoft Graph. It's reading the ID token that was part of the login and giving me basic information. Right? Down here where I'm making a call to the Graph Service Client and getting a specific user, this object is a Microsoft.graph.user object. So they're different. Because ASP.NET has the user login bit set up independent of Microsoft Graph, we had this name collision. We just need to make sure we understand the difference. And then once I have a user, I can do information about that. Right? So if I have a breakpoint on the catch, so you can imagine this may not have worked in the past. So we'll cross our fingers and give it the old college try. And I want to make sure it launches in this browser. So let me set that to be the default. All right, that is working. It opened a new page. It has the right account. It didn't put the address in here, and it's localhost 5001. And when I go here, at the moment, it's taking a long time because, oh, I'm not logged in. And you'll notice all the logging happening here. Behind the scenes, it did a redirect. And it redirected, and because I'm using the same browser session, it knows who I am. Oh, hello, Paul. There we go. So now I've done ASP.NET login. That's all I've done. It's using the identity platform for my application. I'm not inside SharePoint. I'm not inside a Microsoft experience. I'm in my own. And when I go to the profile page, now boom, there it goes. Here's the UPN. It got the photo and the information. And in theory, if I look up Al, I should see the information from Al. But this is going to fail. Now I remember why I had that catch on the exception. Al doesn't have a mailbox, and because Al doesn't have a mailbox, I can't get his photo. So let me do Alex. And Microsoft.com. And now if I do this for Alex, because I'm doing that user.readbasic.all, I can get information about Alex as well. And so I can see the information about Alex, even though Paul is logged on and Alex not. So the last thing I want to show is the login experience. I'm going to go to an in private session here, and I go back to localhost 501. And now, boom, I'm automatically at login.microsoftonline.com. Again, this is that redirect happens because I've said add authentication. And this add authentication will read my app settings, and it says my tenant is this one, 6echo01. And if I look here in the browser, 6echo01, that's the tenant that I'm logging in. So who's logging in? And so let's log in as Alex. Now I'm logged in as Alex. And when I go to the profile and I want to see, I get, by default, I get Alex. There we go. And Alex should be able to get information about Paul. And there we go. Life is good. Right? Now, the last thing I want to show you here, let's close this and how the consent works for me. So let me go back and I'm going to do this again. And let's pick a random, oops, I want to go to this session and go to my list of users. And Megan's a very popular user, but I don't know Megan's password. So real quick, let me just do that. And we'll just copy that. And if I go here and I go to localhost, again, I'm going to log in. So Megan B. And we'll paste the password. Oh, you have to update it. Okay. Now, where in my code did I do this? I didn't. This code happens because I said add authentication. Why would you not do it, right? So we'll pick a password for Megan. Those of you watching the recording later, that password you saw isn't going to work. And now that Megan has logged in, so okay, do you want to do that? And off we go. Now, if I click profile, I'm expecting Microsoft to help me out here again. I didn't have to prompt for consent. And I wonder if it's because an admin had done that already. So let me just close the loop here. If I go back to my sample and I look at the API permissions, yep, so admin consent was performed for everybody. So if I go in here and I think I can remove, no, I don't want to remove the permission. I can't disable the consent. My apologies. So I can't show you the consent, but what would have happened when I clicked on the profile link, the Microsoft.identity.web code would have said, oh, the call to Microsoft.graph failed because of a permission issue. I'm going to inject in here and say, where's the consent? So show me the consent. And it would have worked for me if that had worked. So again, that's all the stuff that's provided for us. Okay, and so a function app. I don't necessarily have time for the function app, but the idea for a function app is going to be very similar to what we've done in the console app. And so when I'm doing a console app, let me go back to the auth library here. And so at the very top, I scrolled over this real quick, was a confidential client. And a confidential client in Microsoft Identity Platform basically means as an app. So if I go into my app registrations and I have a confidential client, I can set up a certificate and or a secret. And so what you'll see here is this application. I have an ID for this application right here, right? And then I have a secret for this application, which has expired. But the idea, of course, is that if I know this value, if I know the secret and the ID, I can use this confidential client authentication provider. And see, I can put in, I'm doing it with the tenant and with the, so there's my client ID and my client secret. And then that application will automatically log in, right? And I can do that same bit of information. The client credential provider won't prompt for login because it doesn't have to, it knows everything already. Now, the other one I would do in a function app, if I needed the user's context, remember my scenario about scheduling something to run overnight, I would use the on behalf of provider. And the on behalf of provider, again, has the client ID and the client secret. But in addition, I'm going to have to provide the, what we call the assertion, the user assertion, so that, because the idea, of course, here is that my function app uses a token cache, and my web app that the user is logging into uses the same token cache. Therefore, at the time I need to do on behalf, and I say I want to use, Paul's account, Paul's token is already in the cache. So I can pull Paul's token and the application secret, the client secret, say, I'm this application, I'm working on behalf of Paul, here's Paul's token, let me go do my thing. So that it comes in out of the cache. So I'm sorry I don't have time for that. Maybe we'll come back if people are stuck and do that. But that's the idea around function apps as well. All right, so just to wrap up, if I go in resources, I'm not sure what's presenting anymore. If I go back to Teams here and oops, share, hit the wrong button. So it probably went dark, don't worry about that. And here we go, zoom all the way to the back. So this top one is a blog post of mine that will have all the resources spelled out on there. The second link is a GitHub repository that has these apps that I've showed you are checked into Git. You're welcome to take them. The tenant IDs are not going to work once we're done here because I'll be deleting those applications. But and then the last one is just a link to the podcast if you want to hear other folks talk about Microsoft Graph-D, Microsoft developer-y things. And so with that, we're at the bottom of the hour, so I will wrap up. But again, I can hang out and answer any questions for folks who have additional time.